Well, time now for View. Look at the latest opinions and talking points in today's newspapers and news websites. The cartoon in the Daily Telegraph follows on from President Biden's words about a new era of US foreign policy. A new chapter has begun, it says, but Chapter 20 in Afghanistan, the American adventure, starts only with the words, The paper's columnist, Madeline Grant, writes that the United States may struggle to recover from Joe Biden's weakness. The cartoon in The Guardian has the US Air Force leaving as the American drones get to work. The Foreign Secretary is the focus of the cartoon in The Times. The Prime Minister asks his cabinet, anyone seen Raab, as his under-fire colleague sits under a burqa in the corner. In The Eye, Katie Bowles goes with the headline, Why Johnson is unlikely to sack Raab. She says the Prime Minister's instinct is to stand by his ministers. Away from Afghanistan, writing in The Sun, the former Education Secretary David Blunkett warns that COVID must not stop children getting back to normal schooling. And in The Times, Daniel Finkelstein, the Conservative peer, Lord Finkelstein, says the world's centre-right lacks a unifying figure as he describes Angela Merkel's imminent departure as another blow for the Western alliance. Well, joining me today to look through those are the journalist and author Yasmin Alibhai-Brown and the Jewish Chronicle's deputy editor Jake Wallis-Simons. Nice to see you both. Yasmin, what do you make of President Biden? Has he let the West down? Is he disgraced? Will he never recover again, as the Telegraph, for example, is suggesting?
I think he has disgraced himself and actually kind of, I am deeply disenchanted with him, and actually was with Obama's foreign policy in Afghanistan. And never forget that Obama actually used more drones and more civilians were killed under his time in office than ever under Bush. So there is a thing that I'm coming to understand, that the Democrats and Republicans are in the end Americans, and not in a good way, in the sense that they will never consider the impact or the consequences of their actions on those who are not Americans, including their allies. And it's quite a hard learning lesson, really.
Jake, on the other hand, successive presidents have said they wanted out of Afghanistan, and it didn't really look as if the level of commitment which there was from Britain, America and allies was ever going to stabilise the country.
No, that's right. I mean, I'm one of those who was not in favour of liberal interventionism in the cases of Iraq and even in Afghanistan, which gained a lot more support at the time. In fact, the only political march I've ever been on was the one against the invasion of Iraq in 2001. And I think that people like me who stood against these things from the beginning have held our heads in our hands throughout. But the thing is that now things are very different. I do feel, as many people feel, that if you break it, you own it. And in invading Afghanistan and getting rid of al-Qaeda to a meaningful extent, then the coalition forces embarked upon this project of nation building, which I think a lot of people would have stood against. But the problem was that we were in a situation where we were propping up a country and preventing it from sliding into a humanitarian catastrophe and a collapse. And although I have sympathies with Joe Biden to some extent in terms of, not pursuing a policy of imposing democracy from 100,000 feet or at the barrel of a gun, I think that once we were in Afghanistan playing that key role in defending what little democracy there was and defending human rights and preventing massacres and whole-scale human rights abuses, we should really have respected that role. And the way in which we withdrew under Biden's leadership, I think, was shameful, and I think he knows it and the world knows it.
What about Dominic Raab then, Yasmin? Is he going to survive, as Katie Bowles suggests in The Eye?
Well, I think Katie Bowles is always very interesting because she seems to know almost everybody in government and the Tory party. And she says something quite interesting, that Boris Johnson's instinct is to stand by his ministers, except when it's not possible to do so, as it wasn't with Matt Hancock. And that Raab is still seen largely as a dependable man, a dependable chap in government. Now, I just think the whole lot that Boris Johnson has gathered around him, he isn't the worst of the worst. What he's done, as the previous interview you had on this program said, was unbelievable. But at the same time, and I completely agree with what Jake has said, the catastrophe, it was kind of the long story of Afghanistan, this particular long story, the catastrophe was perhaps unmanageable, but he should have answered his calls and emails at the least. And where were the intelligence services? He's blaming the military now. How are we so unprepared for this when the Taliban creep, we knew, as newspapers and other media were telling us, was on? That was when action needed to be taken, surely.
Jake, what do you think about Dominic Raab? Is he, the fall guy of the cabinet, as certainly the Times cartoon suggests?
Well, I think with Boris Johnson, there's always a slight sense of there, but for the grace of God, when it comes to cabinet ministers in trouble. We saw that very clearly with Matt Hancock, who in some ways perhaps held a bit of a mirror up to Boris Johnson's own past indiscretions. And I think that a similar thing applies with regard to Dominic Raab, showing this quite astonishing level of incompetence, sadly, over the worst crisis Britain has faced since Suez. I think that Raab's position is very difficult to sustain in the upcoming reshuffle. I think that even Boris will be forced to make him the fall guy, lest the chickens come home to roost at number 10. And I think that in a way, this is difficult for Boris because, as Katie Balls points out, Raab has been loyal. He was the person who was chosen to deputise for Boris when Boris was ill in hospital with COVID, because he knew that Raab wasn't going to try to occupy his seat permanently, unlike some other members of the cabinet. Michael Gove, for example, who has a long history of backstabbing with Boris. But funnily enough, it may be that Michael Gove is put into the position of Foreign Secretary if and when Raab has moved out, because that will keep Michael Gove out of Britain, overseas a lot, and perhaps dancing in clubs around the world rather than making trouble in number 10. So Boris has got options, but I think that we are likely to see the demise of Raab fairly soon.
So, Yasmin, finally, who is there to look up to then on the centre-right now that Angela Merkel is going into retirement? Would you pick out anyone that you admire in that particular section of politics?
No, and I'm quite surprised by this column of Danny Finkelstein, because I would not put, for example, George Bush on the centre-right. I think George Bush Jr. was much more right than the centre-right.
Not until Trump comes along, that's the argument.
But to put Merkel in that group seems to me very weird indeed, because in her time in office, Merkel has been a kind of thorn, if you like, in the right. Her acceptance of 1 million Syrian refugees, for example, was hardly something the centre-right would approve of. And I find this arrogance really quite upsetting at the moment when Afghanistan has collapsed, that there was this major Western domination project. When will we have it back again? We're not going to have it back again. It's going to have to be very different. Most people in the world want our democracy. I think it's a lie to say, oh, our democracy didn't fit them, because so many want to come and live in the West. But it's the way you do it. You don't shoot them into democracy. You do what was done in the Cold War. You coax them into it.
OK, thank you both very much indeed.